Hey guys, got a question for you today. What does it mean to be a peacemaker, and why does Jesus call that a blessing? That's what we're going to be talking about on today's Walking Points. Thanks for joining me. Today we're going to be looking at Matthew 5:9. And Matthew 5:9, again, part of the Beatitudes, the first part of the Sermon on the Mount that we've been looking at. It covers Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And we're not going to cover all the Sermon on the Mount, but there are a few things that I thought were worth pursuing. And so the Beatitudes were certainly part of what I thought we ought to cover together. So Matthew 5:9 says this: Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. I think this may be one of the hardest beatitudes to live out. I mean, they're all hard in their own way, but sometimes we don't want to be peacemakers, whether it's peace between ourselves and others, or whether it is peace between ourselves and God. Sometimes we're hurt, we're wounded, we're mad, whatever it may be, and we want to hold on to it. And so releasing that and pursuing peace is the last thing we want to do. So let me talk a little bit about what peace is and peacemaking is and what it's not. A peacemaker is not someone who just avoids conflict. We recently talked about that in a Bible study that I teach, that peace that the Bible talks about, shalom, is not just the absence of conflict, but it's a restoration, it is wholeness, it is harmony, it's order, it includes all those things. And so you can imagine then, therefore, that being a peacemaker is not someone who's just trying to avoid conflict, someone who crawls under the nearest table whenever conflict breaks out. And I know of what I speak because I hate conflict. But being a peacemaker is someone who actively works to bring reconciliation and to bring harmony into relationships, whether it's a relationship with God or whether it's a relationship with another person. So this kind of peace that we're talking about, again, is more than just the absence of conflict. It's more than the absence of strife. It's the presence of God's wholeness, the presence of God's justice, and the presence of his righteousness. So true peacemakers are going to try their best to seek to heal all those areas, those areas of brokenness, to help restore broken relationships, damaged relationships, and to promote genuine biblical unity through the love and truth of Christ. And that's important because sometimes we can err on the side of love, sometimes we can err on the side of truth, which both of those things sound counterintuitive. But when you're all truth and no love, you come across like a hammer. And when it's all love and no truth, then it's kind of mushy and undefined, no boundaries and things like that. Truth and love is what we're talking about here. So Jesus himself, who is the embodiment of love and truth, is the perfect example here. He is the ultimate peacemaker. He reconciled us to God through his perfect work on the cross on our behalf. So when we follow the example of Jesus, what we're trying to do is to reflect the character of God and to demonstrate that we're his children. Now, anything sacrificial that we do is not an atoning sacrifice or anything like that, but it's still a work where we're trying to bring reconciliation and peace to a situation where there's conflict, where there's strife, where there is genuine brokenness, or whether there's just a perceived slight. All these are areas where a peacemaker would want to go in and try to bring healing and peace into that situation. But let me just tell you, from personal experience as well as what the Bible teaches, this takes humility, doesn't it? I mean, this takes the ability not to be easily offended, not to easily have your feelings hurt. It takes humility, it takes patience, and it takes a very, very, very deep dependence upon God. And so I think it means seeking God's wisdom, not your own, but seeking God's wisdom in those difficult situations, and then being willing to extend the grace of God and to extend his forgiveness as well as your own, even when it's hard. And as I think we've talked about earlier in this series, especially when it's hard. Nobody said this was going to be easy. There was a song that came out, I don't know, when was it, the 60s or the 70s? I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. Well, that applies here. Peacemaking is difficult, especially if you are trying to make peace with someone who that's the last thing they want. They're holding on to their anger, they're holding on to their hurt, they're holding on to their whatever burden or difficult time they're going through, and it's almost like they're taking comfort in how badly they feel about something or how mad they are in something. And there's something about us that's wired to like to we almost enjoy those sorts of feelings, although we would never say that. So trying to bring peace into those situations is difficult enough. But when someone's really angry, and they have every right to be, when they are really hurt and broken, and understandably so, how much more difficult is it in those situations? So here's the thing: peacemakers do not ignore problems, okay? We are not professional problem ignorers, but instead, peacemakers face these problems with a heart of love and always with a desire for God's will to be done in that situation. So we always have to ask ourselves, what is God's will in this situation? What would bring the most glory and honor to God? That's what we need to pursue. What will align with God's will in this particular situation? So as we strive to be peacemakers in our families, in our churches, in our workplaces, in our friendships, in our communities, or wherever else we might need to do that, we want to actually and ultimately always be pointing people to Jesus Christ, who was the ultimate peacemaker. We're not bringing a peace that the world thinks is peace necessarily. I mean, they might agree with it, but Jesus says, I didn't come to bring peace as the world brings peace. So the peace that Jesus brings, to quote Paul from Philippians, it's a peace that surpasses all understanding. It is a deep and abiding peace, and it brings wholeness, and it brings harmony, and it brings order. It brings all these things that are desperately needed in those situations. And so when we live out who we are in Christ, we are showing the world that we belong to Him. And that's the whole point of being a peacemaker. So let me share with you the key principle from today's devotion. Peacemakers reflect the heart of God. Peacemakers reflect the heart of God. So when we work for reconciliation and when we work for true biblical unity, we are demonstrating that we are God's children, that we are new creatures in Christ, and we are always pointing others to that peace that can only be found in Christ. You know, it's interesting. There are several texts in the Old Testament. One that comes to mind is from Jeremiah. And Jeremiah the prophet is proclaiming, beware of those who are riding down from the hillsides or the mountainsides on horses, crying out, peace, peace, when there is no peace. And he describes those who might be hiding a sword because they're coming to bring anything but peace. But they come under the auspice of being peacemakers or declaring that they desire peace. And we want to be careful. We're not pursuing a false peace, but we are wanting to pursue the peace that comes with knowing Jesus Christ and the peace that only He can bring. So here is your personal reflection question for today. How do you, so make it really personal, make sure that you know you're talking to yourself here. How do you typically respond to conflict in your life? I confess to my own shortcoming in this. I hate conflict. I want to crawl under the nearest table whenever there is conflict. But thank the Lord, I have learned over the years that that is not the way to go about it. And by the way, if you're interested in learning more, there are some great books on peacemaking, and I'll be happy to point you in those directions if you want to reach out. But how do you typically respond to conflict in your life? Do you seek peace? Is that what you're pursuing? And are you desiring peace and pursuing it in a Christ-like way? Or, and this is pretty sobering, I guess you could say, or I don't know the right way to put this, but do you do this? Do you avoid peace? Do you ignore peace? Or listen to this, do you escalate peace? Do you avoid it, escalate it, or ignore it? I mean, that's pretty chilling to think that that's often what we do. But when you say it that way, you realize that's not the way to bring about peace. You can't bring about peace by ignoring it. Like a child pulling a cover over his or her eyes at night. And by doing so, they think, there are no monsters in the room if they just hide from them. Or do you escalate it? If someone is angry, do you throw emotional grenades into the middle of the situation, or do you just avoid it? Which I suppose avoiding and ignoring are very similar. So how can you become a true peacemaker in your relationship with other people and in your community, whatever that may be, family, church, workplace, or whatever? And then here is a good action step for you to think about. Identify a situation in your own life that needs the peace of God, it needs peace, and it needs reconciliation. And then just start praying. Don't act too soon, don't act hastily, but pray for God's wisdom, and then take one intentional step. And that's going to be important. The step needs to be intentional. Again, not haphazard. And whether it's through a conversation, whether it's through an act of kindness, whether it's extending forgiveness where maybe you don't want to, but it's the right thing to do, you extend forgiveness to help bring God's peace into that situation. So that's what it means to be a peacemaker. And I hope that was helpful. And I hope that was hopeful and helpful. And I look forward to being with you next time.